Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The autumn of 1932 brought an unusual chill to the remote farmlands of western Nebraska, where the endless prairies stretched like a brown ocean beneath gray skies. It was here, in the forgotten township of Millbrook, a settlement that had never appeared on any official state map, that Deputy Sheriff Harold Wickham made a discovery that would haunt him until his dying day in 1967. The call had come through the crackling telephone lines on October 15th, reporting an abandoned farmstead where livestock had been found wandering unfed for weeks. Local farmers, concerned about disease spreading to their own herds, had requested official intervention. Wickham, a methodical man in his 40s who had served the county faithfully for nearly 2 decades, approached the matter with his characteristic thoroughness, expecting nothing more than the routine documentation of another family driven away by the economic devastation that had already claimed so many rural homesteads. The Brennan property sat isolated among rolling hills, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through stands of dying cottonwoods. The farmhouse itself appeared unremarkable from a distance, a 2-story structure of weathered clapboard siding, its white paint long since surrendered to the elements. A wraparound porch sagged under the weight of accumulated debris, and several windows on the upper floor had been boarded over with rough planks. The barn, painted red in some distant past, leaned precariously to one side, its roof partially collapsed. What struck Wickham immediately upon his arrival was the profound silence that enveloped the property. Even the wind, which typically swept across the Nebraska plains with relentless persistence, seemed to die away as he approached the house. The livestock, 3 dairy cows and a handful of chickens, moved about their enclosures with an unusual lethargy, their eyes holding an expression that the deputy would later struggle to describe in his official reports. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. Wickham called out according to protocol, identifying himself and requesting permission to enter. When no response came, he pushed the door open with the tip of his boot, the hinges protesting with a prolonged groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond. The interior of the house defied immediate comprehension. Every surface, tables, chairs, mantelpieces, even portions of the floor, had been covered with an elaborate arrangement of dolls. They varied tremendously in size and apparent age, from small figures that could fit in a child's palm to life-sized representations that stood propped against walls or seated in chairs around the dining room table. Some appeared to be commercially manufactured toys, their painted faces bright and cheerful, while others showed clear evidence of handcrafted construction, their features carved from wood or molded from clay with varying degrees of skill. What disturbed Wickham most profoundly was the uncanny realism of many specimens. Their glass eyes seemed to track his movement through the rooms, and their expressions held a depth of emotion that no manufactured toy should possess. Several of the larger dolls had been dressed in clothing that appeared to have been tailored specifically for their forms. Not the simple garments typically associated with children's playthings, but elaborate costumes that suggested adult wardrobes scaled down to miniature proportions. In the parlor, Wickham discovered what appeared to be a family gathering frozen in time. 7 dolls of varying sizes had been arranged around a small table set for tea, their positions suggesting animated conversation suddenly interrupted. The largest figure, dressed in a dark suit and seated at the head of the table, bore such a striking resemblance to a human male that the deputy found himself checking twice to ensure it was indeed an inanimate object. The kitchen revealed evidence of recent habitation, dishes in the sink, food in various stages of preparation or decay, a calendar on the wall marked with appointments extending into November. Yet no trace of the Brennan family could be found. Their personal belongings remained undisturbed, their beds unmade, as if they had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. As daylight began to fade, Wickham made the decision to postpone his investigation until the following morning. The atmosphere within the house had grown increasingly oppressive as shadows lengthened, and he found himself unable to shake the sensation that the countless dolls were observing his every movement with an intelligence that transcended their artificial nature. Before departing, he secured the property and made preliminary notes in his logbook, though he struggled to find adequate words to describe what he had witnessed. The official record would eventually show only the basic facts: an abandoned farmstead, missing residents, and an unusual collection of dolls requiring further investigation. That night, Harold Wickham experienced the first of many sleepless nights that would plague him for the remainder of his life, haunted by the memory of glass eyes that seemed far too knowing, and the growing certainty that he had stumbled upon something that defied rational explanation. The following morning brought no relief from the unnatural stillness that had settled over the Brennan property. Deputy Wickham returned with reinforcements. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell and Dr. Margaret Henley, the county's only medical examiner, whose expertise in matters of unexplained death had been requested as a precautionary measure. The trio approached the farmhouse under a sky heavy with storm clouds that seemed to mirror the growing sense of unease that had taken root in Wickham's mind during his restless night. Dr. Henley, a woman of considerable intellect who had earned her medical degree from the University of Chicago despite the social obstacles of her era, brought with her a methodical approach that initially provided some comfort to the investigating officers. Her preliminary examination of the property's exterior revealed several disturbing details that Wickham had overlooked during his initial survey. The vegetable garden behind the house showed signs of recent cultivation, but the plants had been arranged in patterns that served no agricultural purpose. Geometric designs that seemed to follow some obscure symbolic logic. More troubling still was the discovery of what appeared to be a workshop in the barn's undamaged section. Here, the investigators found an elaborate setup for doll construction that suggested a level of craftsmanship far beyond amateur hobby work. Workbenches lined the walls, equipped with tools of remarkable precision, carving implements, brushes for applying paint in minute detail, and molds for creating facial features with disturbing accuracy. Glass eyes of every conceivable color and size filled dozens of small wooden boxes, their surfaces reflecting the investigators' movements like tiny mirrors. The workshop's most unsettling feature was a series of detailed sketches pinned to the walls, depicting human subjects in various poses and expressions. The drawings showed extraordinary skill in capturing not merely physical likeness, but something deeper, the essence of personality that animated each face. Names had been written beneath many of the portraits in a careful, feminine hand. Mrs. Patterson from the general store, young Timothy Walsh, the traveling preacher who stayed 3 nights. The dates accompanying these notations stretched back over several years, suggesting a long-term project of documentation and study. Dr. Henley's examination of the dolls within the house revealed construction techniques that defied easy explanation. Many of the figures incorporated materials that seemed inconsistent with traditional doll making, substances that felt organic beneath their painted surfaces, hair that possessed a texture and color variation suggesting natural rather than manufactured origin. When she attempted to examine one specimen more closely, removing a small section of clothing to study the construction of the torso, she discovered what appeared to be a complex internal structure that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to human anatomy. The medical examiner's growing discomfort became evident in her increasingly terse observations, recorded in a notebook that she kept pressed close to her chest as if protecting its contents from unseen observers. Her training had prepared her to confront death in its many forms, but the dolls presented something that existed in the liminal space between life and artifice, a realm that challenged her scientific understanding of what constituted existence itself. Sheriff Caldwell, meanwhile, focused his attention on gathering evidence of the Brennan family's disappearance. The house yielded a wealth of personal documents that painted a picture of an ordinary farming family struggling with the economic hardships that had befallen much of rural America. John Brennan had been a man of modest education but considerable determination, working to maintain his property despite declining crop prices and mounting debts. His wife, Sarah, appeared to have been a woman of artistic inclinations, based on the numerous sketches and paintings found throughout the house, works that showed a progression from conventional subjects to increasingly abstract and disturbing imagery. The couple's two children, Martha and Samuel, aged 12 and 9 respectively according to school records, had left behind the typical detritus of childhood: books, toys, and clothing that suggested normal, healthy development. Yet even these innocent artifacts seemed somehow tainted by their association with the house's current state, as if the very air within the structure had the power to corrupt whatever it touched. As the investigation progressed, the team began to notice subtle changes in their own behavior and perceptions. Conversations became increasingly subdued, and each investigator found themselves glancing frequently over their shoulders, responding to movement that existed only at the periphery of vision. The dolls, which had initially appeared to be randomly distributed throughout the house, seemed to have shifted positions when viewed from different angles, creating the unsettling impression of a silent audience that rearranged itself to maintain optimal observation of the intruders. By late afternoon, Dr. Henley had documented over 200 individual specimens, each possessing characteristics that challenged conventional understanding of craftsmanship and artistry. Her preliminary report, filed that evening with the county clerk, would become one of the most unusual documents in Nebraska's legal archives, a scientific analysis that struggled to maintain objectivity while describing phenomena that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of rational explanation. The investigation team departed the property as darkness fell, each carrying with them questions that would prove impossible to answer through conventional means. The county courthouse in Millbrook held records dating back to the territory's earliest settlement, and it was here that Sheriff Caldwell began his search for answers regarding the Brennan family's origins and activities. The basement archives, rarely disturbed except by occasional genealogical researchers, contained a treasure trove of documents that would gradually reveal a pattern of disturbing incidents stretching back nearly 2 decades. The Brennan family had arrived in Nebraska during the spring of 1914, purchasing their farmstead from the estate of a previous owner who had died under circumstances that the official records described only as sudden and unexpected. John Brennan's initial land purchase documents showed him to be a man of modest means, yet subsequent filings revealed a steady acquisition of additional property that seemed inconsistent with the agricultural income typical of the region. By 1925, the family had expanded their holdings to include several neighboring farms, all purchased from families who had reportedly relocated to distant states without leaving forwarding addresses. More intriguing still were the medical records maintained by Dr. Henley's predecessor, a physician named Edmund Blackwood, who had served the community until his retirement in 1929. Blackwood's files, stored in meticulous detail, documented a series of unusual consultations involving residents who had reported strange dreams and behavioral changes after visiting the Brennan property. The symptoms described in these records followed a consistent pattern: initial complaints of insomnia and vivid nightmares, followed by periods of unusual docility and detachment from family and community activities. Several patients had reported experiencing what Blackwood termed episodes of dissociation, during which they felt as though they were observing their own actions from outside their bodies. These individuals described sensations of being manipulated like marionettes, their movements controlled by an external force that they could neither identify nor resist. The physician's notes revealed his growing concern about what he privately termed an epidemic of nervous disorders that seemed to center around the Brennan farmstead. The most disturbing entries in Blackwood's files concerned children who had visited the property for what were described as educational demonstrations of doll-making techniques that Sarah Brennan had offered to local families. These young visitors had returned home with behavioral changes that their parents found deeply troubling. Previously active and talkative children became withdrawn and listless, spending hours in motionless contemplation that their families found unnatural. Several parents reported finding their children standing perfectly still in their bedrooms for extended periods, their expressions vacant and their eyes unfocused, as if their consciousness had temporarily departed their physical forms. The historical investigation also revealed a pattern of missing persons reports that had been filed sporadically over the years, though these had never been connected to the Brennan property due to the isolated nature of the community and the limited communication between local law enforcement agencies. Traveling salesmen, itinerant workers, and occasional visitors to the area had simply vanished without explanation, their disappearances attributed to the transient nature of their lifestyles rather than any criminal activity. Church records from the local Methodist congregation provided additional insight into the family's integration into community life. Sarah Brennan had been an active participant in church activities during the early years of their residence, contributing handmade items to charity auctions and volunteering for various social functions. However, her involvement had gradually diminished after 1920, and by 1925, the family had ceased attending services altogether. The pastor's private journal, discovered among the church archives, contained several entries expressing concern about Sarah's increasingly eccentric behavior and her growing obsession with what he described as unwholesome artistic pursuits. The most revealing document uncovered during this phase of the investigation was a letter written by Sarah Brennan to her sister in Ohio, dated March 1931. The correspondence, found among the effects of the sister following her death earlier in 1932, described Sarah's discovery of what she termed the true nature of human essence, and her belief that she had developed techniques for preserving and manipulating this essence through her artistic work. The letter's tone suggested a woman who had crossed the boundary between creative expression and dangerous obsession, describing her dolls not as mere representations, but as vessels capable of containing and directing human consciousness. This correspondence also revealed that Sarah had been conducting what she called experiments in transference, attempting to capture and relocate the essential qualities that distinguished one individual from another. Her descriptions of these procedures were couched in language that combined artistic terminology with concepts that seemed to draw from various occult traditions, creating a hybrid philosophy that defied conventional understanding. The accumulation of historical evidence painted a picture of a family that had gradually isolated itself from normal community life, while developing practices that existed far beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior, even by the tolerant standards of rural Nebraska society. Dr. Henley's return to the Brennan property on the third day of investigation brought with her a collection of scientific instruments borrowed from the state university, including a microscope and chemical testing equipment that she hoped might provide rational explanations for the disturbing materials she had encountered. Her systematic examination of the workshop revealed a level of sophistication that challenged every assumption about the family's capabilities and resources. The workbenches contained an array of tools that appeared to have been custom manufactured for purposes that extended far beyond conventional doll making. Precision instruments designed for delicate surgical procedures sat alongside traditional woodworking implements, while glass containers held substances that defied immediate identification. Some of these materials possessed the consistency of clay, but responded to temperature changes in ways that suggested organic composition, while others appeared to be preservative solutions that maintained their clarity despite containing what looked suspiciously like biological specimens. The most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Henley examined the molds used for creating facial features. These plastiforms showed evidence of having been cast directly from living subjects, capturing details of skin texture and facial structure with an accuracy that could only be achieved through direct contact with human flesh. The collection included molds representing individuals of various ages, from young children to elderly adults, each labeled with dates and cryptic notations that suggested a systematic cataloging process spanning several years. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, the medical examiner discovered Sarah Brennan's private journal, a leather-bound volume that contained detailed records of her experimental procedures. The entries, written in a careful script that gradually deteriorated into increasingly erratic handwriting, documented a progression from innocent artistic endeavors to practices that bordered on the macabre. Early pages described conventional techniques for creating lifelike dolls, but subsequent entries revealed Sarah's growing obsession with capturing what she termed the spark of individuality that distinguished one person from another. The journal's middle sections contained detailed anatomical drawings that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what any self-taught artist should possess. These illustrations showed not merely external features, but internal structures, nervous system pathways, and circulatory patterns that suggested either extensive medical training or access to detailed anatomical references. More troubling still were the notations describing procedures for essence extraction and consciousness transference that read like a bizarre fusion of medical technique and occult ritual. Sarah's writing revealed her belief that human consciousness could be separated from its physical vessel and preserved within carefully prepared receptacles. Her dolls, according to these records, were not mere representations, but functional containers designed to house displaced human awareness. The journal described a complex process involving the application of specially prepared materials to create what she called sympathetic vessels that could attract and contain the essential qualities of their subjects. The workshop's hidden compartments yielded additional evidence of these experiments. Glass vials contained substances that appeared to be organic in nature, but possessed properties that defied conventional classification. When exposed to changes in temperature or light, these materials exhibited responses that seemed almost reactive, as if they retained some vestige of biological function despite their preserved state. Dr. Henley's preliminary chemical analysis revealed the presence of compounds that should not have been stable under normal storage conditions, yet somehow maintained their integrity for extended periods. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of a series of photographs documenting the transformation process that Sarah had developed. These images showed the progression from initial subject documentation through various stages of what appeared to be a complex preservation procedure. The final photographs in each series depicted completed dolls that bore unmistakable resemblances to the human subjects shown in the earlier images, but the intermediate stages revealed procedures that challenged every ethical boundary of scientific inquiry. The journal's final entries, dated just weeks before the family's disappearance, described Sarah's growing conviction that she had achieved a breakthrough in her research. Her writing spoke of successful transferences and the creation of what she called perfect vessels that could maintain the consciousness of their subjects indefinitely. These passages revealed a woman who had completely abandoned any connection to conventional reality. describing her dolls as a new form of life that represented an improvement upon natural human existence. The workshop also contained evidence that Sarah had not been working alone in her final experiments. Tools showed signs of use by multiple individuals, and the organization of materials suggested a collaborative effort that involved other family members. The implications of this discovery cast the disappearance of the entire Brennan family in an even more sinister light, suggesting that whatever had transpired at the farmstead had involved the willing participation of all its residents. Dr. Henley's documentation of these findings would later form the basis for one of the most controversial medical reports in Nebraska's history, a document that raised questions about the boundaries between scientific inquiry and criminal investigation. The investigation's expansion beyond the Brennan property led Sheriff Caldwell to interview the scattered residents of the surrounding area, a task that proved more challenging than anticipated. Many of the neighboring farms had been abandoned during the economic hardships of recent years, leaving only a handful of families within a reasonable distance of the Brennan homestead. Those who remained displayed a marked reluctance to discuss their former neighbors, their responses characterized by nervous glances and abrupt changes of subject that suggested deep-seated fear rather than mere social awkwardness. The most forthcoming witness proved to be Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, an elderly widow who had maintained her late husband's farm despite considerable financial pressure. Her property bordered the Brennan land to the east, and she had observed the family's activities over the course of many years. Mrs. Whitman's account, recorded in painstaking detail by Deputy Wickham, painted a picture of gradual transformation that had alarmed the local community long before the family's ultimate disappearance. According to Mrs. Whitman's testimony, the Brennan family had initially appeared to be model neighbors, participating in community gatherings and maintaining their property according to accepted standards. However, beginning around 1920, subtle changes had become apparent in their behavior and daily routines. The family had begun receiving visitors at unusual hours, often during the deepest part of the night, when honest folk should have been asleep. These nocturnal guests arrived in covered wagons or automobiles with curtained windows, remaining on the property for varying periods before departing as mysteriously as they had come. The witness described observing strange lights emanating from the Brennan workshop during these visits, illumination that flickered and danced in patterns unlike any conventional lamp or lantern. The lights appeared to move with purposeful direction, as if guided by intelligent control, and were often accompanied by sounds that Mrs. Whitman found difficult to describe. These noises resembled neither machinery nor human activity, but something that seemed to exist in the space between the two, rhythmic and purposeful, yet somehow organic in nature. More disturbing still were Mrs. Whitman's observations regarding the behavior of local wildlife in the vicinity of the Brennan property. Birds, which had once nested freely in the trees surrounding the farmstead, had gradually abandoned the area entirely. Domestic animals refused to graze in the fields adjacent to the Brennan land, displaying signs of extreme agitation when forced to approach the property boundaries. Even insects seemed to avoid the area, creating an unnatural silence that had become increasingly pronounced over the years. The elderly woman's most unsettling testimony concerned her interactions with Sarah Brennan during the final years before the family's disappearance. Their occasional encounters had revealed a woman whose personality had undergone a fundamental transformation, displaying knowledge and interests that seemed incompatible with her rural background. Sarah had begun speaking about subjects that no farm wife should have understood: complex philosophical concepts, medical procedures, and historical events that suggested access to educational resources far beyond what the isolated community could provide. During one particularly memorable encounter in the summer of 1931, Sarah had invited Mrs. Whitman to view her latest artistic creations, an invitation that the older woman had accepted out of neighborly courtesy. The dolls displayed in the Brennan parlor had struck Mrs. Whitman as disturbingly lifelike, possessing expressions and postures that seemed to convey individual personalities with uncomfortable accuracy. More troubling still was Sarah's manner of discussing these creations, referring to them not as artistic works, but as if they were living beings with their own thoughts and desires. The investigation also uncovered testimony from traveling merchants and itinerant workers who had passed through the area during the years in question. These individuals, tracked down through considerable effort by law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties, provided accounts that corroborated Mrs. Whitman's observations while adding disturbing details of their own. Several described feeling inexplicably drawn to the Brennan property despite having no business there, experiencing compulsions to approach the farmstead that they found impossible to resist. Those who had actually visited the property reported experiences that defied rational explanation. Time seemed to move differently within the boundaries of the farm, with visits that felt like brief encounters lasting for hours according to their pocket watches. Some described periods of memory loss, finding themselves standing in unfamiliar locations on the property with no recollection of how they had arrived there. Others reported sensations of being observed by unseen watchers, feeling the weight of invisible gazes that followed their movements throughout their visits. The cumulative effect of these testimonies created a picture of the Brennan property as a place where normal rules of reality had gradually ceased to apply. A location that exerted an influence extending far beyond its physical boundaries and affecting all who came within its sphere of influence. The discovery of Sarah Brennan's final journal, hidden within a false bottom of her bedroom dresser, provided the investigation team with their most disturbing insights yet into the family's ultimate fate. This second volume, written during the months immediately preceding their disappearance, documented a series of experiments that had progressed far beyond the preservation techniques described in her earlier writings. The entries revealed a woman who'd become convinced that she had achieved mastery over the fundamental forces that separated life from death, consciousness from matter. The journal's opening pages described Sarah's growing dissatisfaction with her previous work, which she now viewed as crude approximations of her true artistic vision. Her dolls, while remarkably lifelike, remained static representations that failed to capture the dynamic essence of human consciousness. The entries revealed her determination to transcend these limitations through what she termed the final synthesis, a process that would merge her artistic creations with the living essence of their subjects in ways that previous experiments had only approached. Dr. Henley's analysis of the journal's technical descriptions revealed procedures that combined elements of advanced chemistry, surgical technique, and practices that seemed to draw from various esoteric traditions. Sarah had developed a complex understanding of human physiology that extended far beyond conventional medical knowledge, describing processes for manipulating nervous system function and consciousness that should have been impossible for someone without extensive scientific training. Her writing suggested access to information sources that remained unidentified, possibly through correspondence with individuals whose expertise in these matters exceeded her own. The journal documented a series of increasingly ambitious experiments conducted during the final months of 1931 and early 1932. These procedures involved what Sarah described as voluntary subjects who had agreed to participate in her research, though the nature of their consent remained unclear from the available records. The descriptions of these experiments revealed techniques for inducing states of consciousness that allowed for what Sarah termed essence migration, the transfer of an individual's awareness from their physical body into specially prepared receptacles. The most disturbing aspect of these final experiments was Sarah's claim that the process had proven successful. Her journal entries described subjects who had undergone the transfer procedure and continued to exist within their new forms, maintaining their memories, personalities, and capacity for thought, despite the radical transformation of their physical existence. According to Sarah's records, these individuals had not merely survived the process, but had expressed gratitude for their liberation from the limitations of biological existence. The journal's technical sections contain detailed diagrams showing the construction of what Sarah called perfected vessels, dolls created using materials and techniques that represented the culmination of her research. These creations incorporated organic components that had been treated with preservative solutions of her own devising, creating hybrid forms that possessed the durability of artificial constructs while maintaining the essential properties necessary for housing human consciousness. The construction process required precise timing and environmental conditions, with each stage of creation corresponding to specific phases of what Sarah described as consciousness preparation in the intended subject. Perhaps most chilling were the journal's references to the participation of Sarah's own family members in these final experiments. The entries suggested that John Brennan and their children had not merely witnessed these procedures, but had volunteered to serve as subjects themselves, convinced by Sarah's arguments that the transformation represented an improvement upon natural human existence. The journal described their enthusiasm for the process, their eagerness to transcend the limitations of physical form and achieve the immortality that Sarah's techniques promised to provide. The final entries in the journal, dated just days before the family's disappearance, documented the completion of what Sarah considered her masterwork. She described the successful transformation of all 4 family members, their consciousness successfully transferred into vessels that would preserve their essence for eternity. The writing conveyed a sense of triumph and fulfillment, as if Sarah believed she had achieved something unprecedented in human history. Yet the journal's concluding passages also revealed an unexpected development that had complicated Sarah's plans. The transformed family members had begun to exhibit behaviors that differed from her expectations, displaying capabilities and desires that extended beyond the parameters of her original design. They had developed what she described as autonomous impulses, acting independently of her direction and pursuing objectives that she found increasingly difficult to understand or control. The journal's final entry, written in handwriting that showed clear signs of distress, described Sarah's growing realization that her creations had evolved beyond her ability to manage them. The transformed family members had begun to demonstrate an interest in expanding their numbers, seeking to share their new form of existence with others in ways that Sarah had not anticipated or planned for in her original research. The investigation reached its most disturbing phase when Dr. Henley's detailed examination of the dolls revealed evidence that challenged every assumption the team had made about the nature of the Brennan family's disappearance. Her scientific analysis, conducted with instruments borrowed from the State University's medical department, uncovered biological materials within the doll constructions that defied conventional explanation. Tissue samples extracted from several specimens showed cellular structures that remained viable despite their incorporation into artificial forms, suggesting preservation techniques that exceeded any known scientific methods. The breakthrough came when Dr. Henley discovered that certain dolls responded to external stimuli in ways that inanimate objects should not. Temperature changes caused subtle alterations in their facial expressions, while variations in light intensity seemed to trigger movement so slight that they were barely perceptible to the naked eye. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that some specimens exhibited what appeared to be respiratory patterns, their chests rising and falling in rhythms that mimicked human breathing despite the absence of any visible respiratory apparatus. Deputy Wickham's careful cataloging of the dolls Positions throughout the house revealed a pattern that had initially escaped notice. The figures had been arranged not randomly, but according to a complex organizational system that seemed to reflect social hierarchies and family relationships. The largest dolls occupied positions of prominence, while smaller figures were grouped around them in configurations that suggested ongoing interactions and relationships. This arrangement implied that the dolls were not merely decorative objects, but participants in some form of communal existence that continued despite their transformed state. The most significant discovery occurred when the investigation team realized that the number of dolls in the house corresponded exactly to the number of missing persons reported in the area over the previous 2 decades. Each disappearance could be matched to a specific doll, with the timing of the vanishings correlating to the creation dates found in Sarah Brennan's journals. The implications of this correlation suggested that the missing individuals had not simply vanished, but had been transformed into the very objects that now filled the farmhouse. Dr. Henley's examination of the 4 largest dolls, positioned prominently in the main parlor, revealed construction techniques that differed significantly from the others. These specimens incorporated materials and methods that represented the pinnacle of Sarah's experimental work, displaying a level of sophistication that suggested they were her most important creations. The positioning and treatment of these figures implied that they held special significance, possibly representing the transformed members of the Brennan family themselves. The investigation team's growing understanding of the situation was accompanied by increasingly disturbing personal experiences. All 3 investigators reported vivid dreams featuring the dolls, nocturnal visions in which the figures moved and communicated with a clarity that seemed to transcend the boundaries between sleep and waking consciousness. These dreams shared common elements, the dolls expressing awareness of the investigation, demonstrating knowledge of the team members' personal lives, and conveying messages that suggested they retained the memories and personalities of their original human forms. Sheriff Caldwell's review of the physical evidence revealed additional details that supported the theory of consciousness transference. Personal belongings found throughout the house showed signs of recent use despite the family's apparent absence, suggesting that the transformed individuals continued to interact with their environment in ways that were not immediately visible to outside observers. Clothing had been moved, books showed evidence of recent reading, and meals appeared to have been partially consumed, all indicating ongoing activity within the seemingly abandoned structure. The investigation's most chilling revelation came through Dr. Henley's analysis of the preservation solutions found in Sarah's workshop. Chemical testing revealed compounds that should not have been stable under normal conditions, yet somehow maintained their effectiveness for extended periods. More disturbing still was the discovery that these solutions contained biological components that appeared to be derived from human sources, suggesting that Sarah's techniques required materials that could only be obtained through procedures that violated every ethical boundary of medical practice. The accumulated evidence painted a picture of a family that had not disappeared in any conventional sense, but had undergone a transformation that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human existence. The dolls were not mere representations of missing persons, but were the missing persons themselves, preserved in forms that maintained their consciousness while transcending the limitations of biological existence. As the investigation team prepared to document their findings, they faced the unprecedented challenge of reporting discoveries that existed beyond the boundaries of accepted reality. Evidence that suggested the successful achievement of goals that science considered impossible. The final phase of the investigation brought revelations that would forever alter the lives of those involved. Discoveries that challenged not only their understanding of the Brennan case, but their fundamental beliefs about the nature of existence itself. As the team prepared to conclude their work and file their official reports, they encountered evidence that the transformation process described in Sarah's journals had not ended with the family's disappearance, but continued to operate according to principles that defied rational comprehension. Dr. Henley's final examination of the dolls revealed a disturbing development that had escaped previous notice. Several specimens showed signs of recent modification, alterations that could not have been made by the missing Brennan family. New clothing had been added to some figures, their positions had been adjusted with careful attention to detail, and fresh preservative treatments had been applied to maintain their condition. These changes suggested that someone or something continued to care for the collection, maintaining the dolls with the same meticulous attention that Sarah had demonstrated in her journals. The investigation team's growing unease was compounded by their realization that they themselves had begun to experience the same symptoms described in Dr. Blackwood's medical records. Sleep became increasingly elusive, replaced by vivid dreams in which they found themselves walking through the Brennan house as permanent residents rather than temporary visitors. These nocturnal visions possessed a clarity and consistency that suggested they were more than mere products of psychological stress, feeling instead like glimpses into an alternative reality where the boundaries between observer and observed had dissolved. Deputy Wickham's final survey of the property revealed evidence of recent activity that contradicted the assumption that the farmstead had been abandoned. Footprints in the soft earth around the house showed patterns of movement that suggested regular inhabitants, while the vegetable garden displayed signs of ongoing cultivation despite the absence of any visible caretakers. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the livestock, which had initially appeared neglected and malnourished, had somehow recovered their health and vitality without any apparent source of care or feeding. The investigation's most profound revelation came through Sheriff Caldwell's discovery of a hidden room beneath the farmhouse, accessible through a concealed entrance in the basement floor. This chamber contained what appeared to be Sarah's final workshop, a space dedicated to the creation of vessels intended for specific individuals. The room held partially completed dolls that bore unmistakable resemblances to the three investigators, their features captured with an accuracy that could only have been achieved through detailed observation and study. The implications of this discovery were inescapable. The transformed Brennan family had been observing the investigation team throughout their work, documenting their appearance and characteristics with the same methodical precision that Sarah had applied to her previous subjects. The partially completed dolls suggested that the investigators had been selected as candidates for the transformation process, their essence deemed suitable for preservation within the eternal collection that the farmhouse had become. Dr. Henley's analysis of the materials found in this hidden workshop revealed that the transformation techniques had continued to evolve beyond Sarah's original methods. The preservation solutions showed improvements in stability and effectiveness, while the construction techniques demonstrated refinements that suggested ongoing experimentation and development. The transformed family members had not merely maintained Sarah's work, but had advanced it, developing capabilities that exceeded even her considerable achievements. The investigation team's final night at the property brought experiences that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. Each member reported periods of lost time, during which they found themselves in different locations within the house with no memory of how they had arrived there. During these episodes, they experienced sensations of profound peace and contentment, feelings of belonging that seemed to emanate from the very structure itself. The house had become more than a mere building. It had evolved into a living entity that welcomed new additions to its eternal community. The official reports filed by the investigation team were necessarily incomplete, omitting details that would have challenged the credibility of their findings. The documented evidence supported conclusions of missing persons and unusual artistic practices, but the deeper implications of their discoveries remained unrecorded in any public document. The Brennan property was officially declared abandoned and eventually sold to the state, though no subsequent owners ever remained for extended periods. The three investigators carried their experiences in silence, bound together by knowledge that could never be fully shared or understood by those who had not witnessed the transformation of human consciousness into forms that transcended the boundaries between life and art, between individual existence and collective immortality. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.